Welcome to this training video which supports the delivery of the Year 9 Media Literacy Unit as part of the OAT Citizenship and PSHE Education curriculum. This unit consists of 5 lessons. It includes content on news values, trustworthiness, verifying content, and the emotions which people may encounter as they are viewing various sorts of information and media. These lessons then provide the basis of the review model, and that becomes the focus of the final lesson, in which pupils put into action the skills they've learnt about to try to determine whether or not a news story is legitimate. This video is going to be a brief overview of the lessons from the unit. It won't cover every activity, it's just going to focus on explaining a few of the key tasks and concepts to try to help in delivering high quality lessons. Ground rules are a really core part of citizenship and PSHE lessons. They set the tone and they ensure that pupils know what is and is not going to be tolerated in the classroom beyond your usual school rules. Depending on the class, you might wish to discuss ground rules at the start of the lesson, or you could do it at the end, but either way it's important to have them agreed upon before the end of the first lesson so that going forwards the pupils know what to expect. The most effective ground rules involve pupil contribution, asking them for suggestions and tweaking their suggestions if you need to try to align with certain ground rules that you are after. If pupils are running out of ideas, you could propose one of your own, but try to do it in a way where you're offering it and offering an option to change it if needed. So maybe asking, what about if we added something about the types of words that we're using? And then allowing pupils to continue on from there. You could then take the ground rules and make them visible. So either sticking them to pupils' books or folders, or as I've done here, creating a display in the classroom so they're high profile and easy to refer back to. This image here was from my classroom, and I used a display with the characters from Up, which are just out of shot at the bottom, so each of the ground rules were printed onto a different balloon shape. It's also really important to reinforce that you're going to follow the ground rules as well, so you're all in it together. But you do need to, as part of this conversation, clarify you may need to report certain safeguarding issues in an appropriate way. So making sure from the outset that pupils are aware of that. So on to the first lesson then. When starting the Media Literacy Unit, it's really helpful to make some contextual links for pupils. So this data comes from the Ofcom 2023 News Consumption Report. It's a good way of getting pupils aware of different sources of media information. I'd be asking pupils to tell me what they can understand from the image, so hopefully they'll be able to make some comparisons about the extent to which different age groups are using the same platform, so how frequently everyone listens to the radio, but then also making comparison of specific age groups across the different platforms, so trying to identify which source is most preferable for those under 24 as well. This image possibly feels a little bit odd without context, but essentially it's a metaphor to try to introduce the concept of information neighbourhoods. So just as we would want to know where the shiny tourist attractions are or the possibly dodgy dangerous areas in a new city, we need to be aware of the type of information that we're encountering so that we know how seriously to take it, or whether it's meant to be something quite humorous or whether it's just trying to sell us something as well. The concept of the 6 information neighbourhoods comes from the Centre for News Literacy at Stony Brook University near New York. The source on the left here is clearly advertising. It's designed to promote the new version of the double cheeseburger, even though what someone receives in their order doesn't necessarily look exactly like this. Pupils might initially identify the source on the right as an advertisement as well, which in some ways is right. It's really important that pupils are aware that sources don't always neatly fit into one neighbourhood. We could argue that this is potentially an example of propaganda, but more in a positive sense. We tend to think of propaganda as exaggerating information and drawing tenuous conclusions or building upon little breadcrumbs of information, although propaganda can be used in a more positive way as well. So Paddington here is being used to try to show the value of immigrants. As another example of this, in sense of positive propaganda, you could look at the posters or advertisements asking people to stay at home during COVID, although that interpretation could differ based on a person's personal views of lockdown. The Diamond 9 task at the beginning of lesson 2 is designed to act as a baseline about who pupils do and don't trust. After pupils have completed their worksheets, it's important to share ideas about where they've ranked each of these options. So the way that I've managed this discussion in the past is to ask pupils to raise their hands for an option if they put it in their top 3 spaces, so the very top or the next level down. If you wanted to, you could just do the one at the very top. So I would ask them to raise their hands to start off with if they ranked the newspapers in their top 3, and then I'd tally those votes in a green pen. And that would be signifying about the idea of trust being positive or good. I then move on to family members, and I collect that tally, and then I go through all the rest. So I'd have done all the way about the ones at the very top. Once you've done it once, the pupils get used to the system and it gets a lot quicker, and you can also use this again in subsequent lessons or units. I then go back with the red pen and I tally the lowest results. So we've got 6 here for newspapers, and then I go all the way through again. This is now showing the data from the whole class, and we're going to now use this as the discussion point to try to get started about thinking why people might distrust newspapers more than they trust them. Why do they distrust teachers more than they trust them? Are they serious? Are they joking because they've had me in lessons before and they know what I'm like? Why is it that they think that friends or family members are more trustworthy as well? So being able to identify fairly anonymously the whole class's input then can trigger this conversation. The concept of bias is defined differently within media literacy to how it might be defined in history or in other subjects. So from a media literacy perspective, the message needs to be reinforced over time and not just from one single article. That's because that single article, in theory, is reporting on an individual event. So just because it's negative about teachers or negative about politicians is not to say that they're always commenting in that sense. However, when we've got multiple front pages like we do in this image, we can see what appears to be a sustained message over time, which is where we could make that claim of bias. However, the flip side is that this is clearly a selection of front pages from the Daily Express, and it has been curated. It's therefore possible that the Daily Express has published content praising immigrants or with positive news stories. So it could have been that this has been carefully selected to give the impression that the Daily Express is only publishing negative information. It's important that pupils are aware that what isn't shown in a source or in a story is just as important about what is shown. People often use the term fake news, but it's problematic because it's a bit of a catch-all term. Obviously, it can refer to content which is fabricated, but it's also a convenient way of someone denying the accuracy of something that makes them look bad. Using the terms misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation helps to distinguish between the accuracy and the intent of specific content. So in the example of a government minister being unaware that a possibly scandalous event had happened and denying that took place, that would be misinformation because they've given what they know to be true with the best of intentions, even though that turned out to be wrong. Sometimes journalists get stories wrong, they get information wrong, so that's why we need to follow that story over time. However, if the same minister knew that the event had happened and denied it, this would be disinformation because they're deliberately giving misleading information. The disclosure of the scandal itself would be malinformation. That's because it's accurate content which is being shared with the intent of causing harm. In this sense, if it was a scandal about the government, then this would be the media holding the government to account. One of the tasks in Lesson 3 asks pupils to try to find out whether or not the sources accurately depict what they claim to be showing, so whether they're real or not. For the newspaper article claiming to show pink water coming from the tap, pupils could search for the reputation of the CBC as the source. They'd then find out that it's the Canadian equivalent of the BBC. An online search for the words "on away pink water" then would show multiple other results from the BBC, Sky News, CNN and others. In theory, it could be misinformation or a hoax, even though lots of people have reported on it, but given that the story is from 2017, it's likely that it would have been corrected now if it wasn't true. For the photo of the flowers, some people might recognise Imager as an image sharing platform. The content is unverified and can be uploaded by anyone. Although the title claims to be from Fukushima, with the implication that the flowers are mutated due to the nuclear accident in 2011, there's nothing actually in the picture to give any idea about where it was taken. If pupils were doing a little bit more digging online, they might find an article from Snopes, which gives further details about the image, and that includes a Twitter post from 2015, which again claims the picture was from Fukushima, but there's still no proof that the mutation itself was due to radiation levels. The same article also shows examples of similar mutations in daisies in other locations around the world. If pupils aren't able to access the internet for this task, you could instead ask them to outline the steps they take to try to work out whether or not the sources are accurate. This activity from Lesson 4 tries to help people to recognise the ways in which different people might respond to the same article. Our beliefs and experiences can shape our initial reactions to different information. So the single parent who's wanting to return to work might welcome the decision to offer extra free childcare, because then they wouldn't have to worry about those costs. However, a 40-year-old man might feel really upset about his taxes being used in this way. It's also really important that alternative viewpoints are mentioned beyond just those initial superficial responses. Perhaps that 40-year-old man is actually the owner of the childcare centre. He thinks there's going to be more business opportunities, and therefore he really thinks this is a great idea. Maybe the single parent is really unhappy because they've been paying childcare for so long, just as their child is about to get the free childcare from the age of 3 anyway. It's not always just a one perception for a specific group of people. Ultimately, the point of this is to try to help pupils to get inside the minds of other people. You could easily change the stimulus and the groups if you wanted to. In terms of running the activity, you could divide the class into 5 groups and assign them, or 10 groups and assign them to different groups of pupils, or you could just ask pupils to discuss them with those around them and try to get them to consider the views of multiple people, and then having a conversation with the wider class. For this task, I've used the Raheem Sterling article because it's someone that pupils can fairly easily recognise. It links to the news value of celebrity, and it also ties in with the potential undercurrents of racism in the Equality Act, as it is covered in other units within the curriculum. You could easily swap this for a different topic. It's really important that you've got an issue which has sufficient backstory to be able to look at for that over time aspect. After reading the article, you've got discussion questions on slide 16 about the viewpoint and the reason for the tattoo. The story focuses on the views of the campaigners, but adds the information about Sterling's father right at the very end of the story. And if we think about the structure of different news articles, it's a bit like an inverse triangle. The first sentence or paragraph has an overview of the key information, and what comes at the end of the article tends to be perceived as less important, because lots of people don't really read that article in full. Obviously, with the media literacy definition of bias, the article itself isn't biased. It's one article, it's fairly objective, they have reported both sides of the story, they've given the campaigners' comments and the explanation. But when we start to look at the other stories about Sterling, again they're factual, they tend to have quite a negative slant on them. When discussing about whether or not there is bias overall over time, pupils might highlight that this could be a curated selection of articles, and maybe there's some that praise him but haven't been provided to pupils. They might say that a tabloid newspaper is going to focus on gossipy stories where possible, and so good news doesn't sell. Or they might agree that the comments are unfairly focused on the negatives. The review model combines a range of elements that we can consider when deciding the accuracy of a source, whether that's a news article or a social media post or something else. After a CPD tour to the USA in 2019, I worked with Helen Blatchford to create this model as a process, and it's since been adopted by the Association for Citizenship Teaching. Different parts of the review model have been featured in the preceding 4 lessons. This final lesson is really a culmination of pupils' learning. The video on slide 10 of the slide deck details each of the steps involved in the process. In short, it's about considering the reputation of the source publishing the article and any sources of information in the article as well. Identifying relevant evidence mentioned in the article, and again, things that might not be featured. Trying to verify that evidence. Thinking about why the article has been published, so considering the different information neighbourhoods. Reflecting on how the article makes you or others feel, and then taking all of it into account and deciding what you want to do next, whether or not it's reliable, whether you're going to share it or whether you're going to ignore it. The main task of Lesson 5 centres on this article about a one-direction concept. Pupils are given a range of resources to help them to follow the review model in a semi-scaffolded way. So rather than just setting them loose on the internet, certain resources have been provided which they can use to come to a conclusion. Hopefully, by going through each of the provided resources and going through each step of the review model, they will then be able to decide by the end of it whether or not they believe the story to be accurate. There's a range of places that you can get other resources to use in media literacy lessons as well. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation is the Australian equivalent of BBC. The fact that I'm originally from Australia is not the reason that I've included them here. The News Values video is from the ABC children's news programming called BTN, or Behind the News. There's also a range of other videos and interactive tasks which could be used in the classroom as well. Checkology is a free online platform from the News Literacy Project in the USA. It allows you to set interactive tasks for pupils to complete either during lessons or for homework. The Newspaper for Schools News Library is free for UK primary and secondary schools, as long as you've got a valid paid-for NLA copyright licence. The NLA oversee copyright for this press, and schools usually have the licence already. You can search by keywords, you can download clips of news articles, or you can download entire pages of newspapers as well. And finally, Newswise is run by the Guardian Foundation. They offer news literacy resources for primary schools, but they could also be used in secondary as well.